here for, so bear with me one more second. You'd think after 8 weeks I had this down to perfection, but it is what it is. So again, my name is Rick Jewell. I am an executive assistant with the Aurora Mental Health Center, and I will be acting as the moderator for today's webinar. This actually is our 7th webinar in this series. However, there are still glitches, technical difficulties, internet connections, things like that, that do arise. So I do apologize in advance, and we'll just work through that as a group. I have muted and stopped the video feed for all participants in order to focus on the presenter, as well as to protect your individual privacy. This webinar is being recorded and will be utilized for both the Aurora Chamber of Commerce and Aurora Mental Health Center's internal and external audiences in order to continue supporting our community during this challenging time. To further protect your individual privacy, each of you have the ability to click on the 3 dots on the upper right hand of your individual screens and then rename yourself, or even just put ... in place if you would like. When we get to the question and answer section during the last 10 to 20 minutes of today's webinar, please direct all questions to me, Rick Jewell, via the chat privately, and then I will state the question to the presenter and all. This will promote more privacy as to who is asking the question. However, if you do choose to have your name visible, that is fine. And if you wish me to unmute your your audio so that you can ask the question directly, please state so in your private chat message that you send to me. If some of you are unfamiliar with how Zoom is working at this point in time, the chat feature is found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And when you open up the chat feature box, it automatically defaults to everyone. You can simply change that everyone in the drop-down menu to say Rick Jewell, in order to be able to send those chat questions to me privately. You may send questions to me throughout the presentation. However, they will not be asked until the Q&A time at the end. And that concludes housekeeping items. So at this moment, I would like to introduce everyone to Debbie Stafford. She's going to be our presenter today, and I will turn it over to Debbie right now.
Well, thank you so much. I made the mistake of clicking to see who was on with us today, and I somehow lost myself. So does everybody see me in an okay spot so that we can move along? So
I think you look good.
Okay, yes, thank you.
You're the only one who has video feed, so you should be good.
Thank you. Yep. Happy Friday, everybody. And I'm Debbie Stafford. I want to talk to you today about domestic violence, and especially the impacts right now through this time of social distancing and then safer at home. One of the things we know is that not everybody is safer at home. Rick, if you want to go ahead and start our slide presentation.
Certainly.
We'll be sending this slide presentation out to everybody who is a part of this today. And so I have been a domestic violence treatment provider for 28 years. It's always been my part-time work. I am approved by the state to treat male, female, gay, and lesbian offenders. So if we move on, I want to talk about, you can go to the next slide. I want to talk about some of the dynamics of what happens with domestic violence. We know that domestic violence is learned behavior. We also know that it is repeated behavior. It is enhanced by substance abuse. And we hear a lot about the opioid crisis. We hear a lot about people who struggle with substance abuse. Even through this COVID-19 issue, it's amazing that people really fought to keep liquor stores open, to keep the marijuana shops open. We know that domestic violence is a cycle, and understanding that, we also know that to break the cycle, it usually takes an intervention. So you can go to the next slide, please, Rick. Thank you very much. So one of the things that happens with domestic violence, because we understand it's oftentimes generational, it's oftentimes passed down from one generation to the next, we know that the psychological pain is oftentimes much more damaging than even the physical injuries that can happen. We know that isolation, power, and control are clear parts of what can happen with domestic violence. But we also know that it's not just about what can happen to the family, but it's also knowing when somebody would be involved physically, sexually, financially, but bringing harm to the pets. So we know that how somebody treats their pets oftentimes shows us how they would treat their family. All of these acts of violence are usually about power and control. You can go to the next slide. So in Colorado, we know that in 2018, there were over 16,700 people reported one or more domestic violence crimes to Colorado law. I think it will be interesting with COVID-19 when they come back and look at long-term spikes. Because one of the things that we know, the courts are still open right now to manage restraining orders, but there are many people that are being arrested, that are being convicted of domestic violence. And know that domestic violence convictions come usually when somebody has been identified as an intimate partner in the present or the past, or if it is an adult family member. So we also know that in 2018, 43 Coloradoans were killed by a former or current intimate partner, and almost 70% of those were with guns. And we know that of those deaths, also children were also sometimes the victims as well as the victim or the offender. We know that stalking is a very, very critical dynamic of recognizing domestic violence, and over 325,000 Coloradoans are stalked during their lifetime. Go to the next slide. So I know that on this call today is Andy Starrett, and Andy, I want to welcome you. Andy Starrett has become a dear friend to me through horrific tragedy. So on this slide, and Andy at the end, if there's anything you are comfortable saying, but Andy has given me permission to tell the story briefly of his daughter, his beautiful daughter, Allie Raber. Allie was murdered by a man who is now awaiting trial. And she was 18 years old. She was murdered at the hotel right at I-225 and 6th Avenue, the Knights Inn. We know that her alleged killer actually fled the country, and Andy actually led the charge and helped get him captured through some international processes. And it's been so traumatic. One of the things that I want us to realize with COVID-19, this trial should have taken place in April. And I actually went to the courtroom with them, I think, in January or February, and I don't recall, Andy, you'll have to let us know, but went in there for preliminary hearings. And then with COVID-19, the trial has been postponed to June. And so Andy has started the Allie Raber Foundation, trying to educate other, especially a lot of young people, but people in general, about domestic violence and being aware of the horrific entrapment that can happen with domestic violence. Andy, I would invite you to say more now, but because of time, we'll leave it for questions at the end. But again, thank you for allowing me to share the tragic story of your daughter, Allie. I was the pastor that officiated this funeral. There were over 300 people who attended. These students had just graduated 2 weeks before they graduated from high school, and you imagine the trauma that this was for everybody. We'll move on to the next slide. So we know that during COVID-19, some of the, what I would call undiagnosed impacts. We understand that isolation, feeling powerless, feeling fear, feeling financial dependence, food insecurity, increased substance abuse, a lot of times control, co-combative fighting, where it's kind of going back and forth, modeling learned behavior, and also moving to the severe risk of injury or death. And you can see here, even in the picture, how you break the cycle, because when children are hearing these dynamics, they believe that's what a relationship looks like. And so part of what we have to do when the police are involved is really try to determine probable cause and try to get some help. You can just put all the bullets there, Rick. It actually goes quicker. Thanks. So we understand that untreated childhood trauma is a stronger indicator of potential future domestic violence. We know that children will learn by what they see and hear. You know, we're worried about school, we're worried about so many things, but the biggest schooling for our children is at home. So at home is where we teach children what a relationship looks like, and children are 750% more likely to repeat what they have seen and heard. And even children in the womb are aware of arguing, they're aware of the dynamics, they're aware of the trauma and the voices, and children can be born traumatized who've been involved with domestic violence. We know that early childhood trauma sets up just an ongoing, you go back just one real quick, I'm sorry, Rick, but early childhood trauma actually sets up the person to become a possible victim or a perpetrator. Okay, now we'll move along.
Okay.
So what I have next on the next slide is what we call the cycle of violence. And has anybody had this experience? You've been involved with family or friends or people, and you know that they seem to be doing okay, and then they have a blow up, and then they kind of forgive each other and they work it out, and they'll go through that cycle more frequently and more frequently. What they tell us is that couples who go through the cycle of violence and break up and get back together between 6 to 9 times. Each time they break up and get back together, there is a higher risk of severe injury or even death. And so part of what happens in Colorado, but now Colorado was the 8th state in the nation to implement very tough domestic violence laws. They started in 1982. And while I was in the legislature, I actually had them compile every single law that had been put in place. And so Colorado lives with what we call probable cause mandatory arrest, meaning if you look at this cycle, once the tension builds and things come to a breaking point, you try to do an intervention and stop it when the tension is building before it gets to the explosion or where the abuse takes place. If the explosion or the abuse takes place and law enforcement is called in, probable cause mandatory arrest says if law enforcement can determine probable cause, then they are required by law to do a mandatory arrest, is to separate the parties, to get an idea of to calm things down, figure out who is safe. Couples that keep getting back together, they don't gain different skills or tools, they go through this cycle over and over, are much more likely to live in very frightening and unhealthy dynamics. You can move along, Rick.
Oops, sorry.
You're okay. So again, this is what we call the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel is what it's really an indicator of a lot of the dynamics that are taking place with domestic violence. And so using coercion and threats, trying to manipulate somebody, using emotional abuse, using isolation. So what's been happening right now? Isolation. We keep hearing that there are fewer calls about child abuse right now. We are hearing that we aren't hearing, and that becomes more frightening. We know that in domestic violence, they have what's called pecking order battering. And so it may go from whoever the aggressor is down to the next one, down to the next one. That's why sometimes in the schools, when you have a child that's acting out, they end up maybe in the principal's office, and they might say, we want to bring in the parents and find out what's going on. Oftentimes when children, and it doesn't mean always, but when they're acting out in school, sometimes they have things going on in their personal world that they can't control, but they're kind of passing along that pain and that control to those around them. We also like using economic abuse or male privilege. And I will tell you, abuse goes either way. Men can be abused, women can be abused. It goes either way. We'll go to the next slide.
Oh.
So one of the things that I've had to learn in working with the courts is that when a person is arrested, until they are convicted, it makes a determination what their next steps are. In Colorado, there would be mandatory treatment. There would be mandatory, it used to be straight 36 weeks on a first arrest. It was 72 weeks on a second charge. And it could have been much longer than that after that. Now people are put in a track system. And depending on their level of risk and danger, or if a weapon was involved or if strangulation was involved, then the supervision is extremely intense. So one of the things that is really worrisome right now with the COVID-19 is a lot of telehealth has been being used with offenders. And you can regulate an offender with an ankle monitor. You can certainly regulate them through a lot of things, but you have to have a lot of contact. And so looking at some of the risk factors, unemployment is a risk factor. And what are we hearing right now? A lot of people have not been able to work because of all the changes in what we're allowed to do. And so people really starting to use substance more, and then realizing if somebody has a missed UA or however they are managing some of their circumstances right now. Sometimes people are moving into depression, thoughts of suicide, and we know that a lot of domestic violence happens over social media. And so one of the things that happens is a lot of stalking happens over social media, but people sometimes also are using obsessive jealousy, and they might see, I've seen people beat a partner because their partner put likes on another man's Facebook page. And so that somebody could actually take that to an extreme and say, you're having an affair, you're cheating on me if you said you liked Mr. Jones' page. We'll go to the next one. So one of the questions is, can people change? How do you go through change? So these are what we call the stages of change. And this is good for any kind of change. Has anybody here ever thought you should lose weight, maybe besides me, or you felt like you wanted to change your diet, or you wanted to change how you did certain things for yourself? Sometimes we're in a state where, first of all, we don't even think we have a problem. Maybe then we go to the doctor, or we get on the scale, or something happens, or all of a sudden you can't pull your pants on. Has anybody heard that expression, the COVID 15 pounds? But you're trying to pull your pants up and all of a sudden the zipper's not working so well. But so sometimes we don't think we have a problem. And that happens a lot with domestic violence. When the people are engaged in it, they don't even understand that's not necessarily loving or healthy or normal. And so what happens is sometimes it's when the police take somebody off in handcuffs and they spend the night or the weekend or a few days in jail until they can be arraigned, and then they're forced into therapeutic treatment. But they may have not thought they really needed to make a change. Then they come to a point where maybe they're sitting in jail, or maybe they've been put out of the house with a restraining order and they're sleeping in their car or at a hotel or on their mother's couch or somewhere. And they begin to say, maybe I have to think about a change. The preparation for change in the domestic violence world still often is by force. Oftentimes the force is the courts or probation stating you've got to do certain things. You're going to take weekly classes. You're going to do other accountable things. You're going to not drink. You're not going to use. You're going to have monitored sobriety. So people can begin to make the changes, go into maintenance. Sometimes they'll go into relapse. They'll have a setback. We know that, especially people using substance abuse. There's a much greater chance of up to 10 relapses with somebody using substance abuse. But change can happen. Okay, Rick, we'll go to the next slide. So one of the things that we understand about traumatized children, especially in early stages of psychosocial development, a young child who's experienced trauma can possibly emotionally be stuck at the age of the trauma. And then that child may grow and move on. And who's ever had this happen to you? So you've been involved in a conflict with somebody. and words happened or whatever happened, and you walk away and scratch your head, and you know you were looking at an adult, but you say to yourself, I think I just dealt with a 7-year-old. And it feels that way. Has anybody ever had any, all I see are your names, so I can't see some of your reactions. But what we try to do with people dealing with domestic violence, and this can happen with people who've dealt with trauma, but to go back and recognize the age of the trauma, the age of the individual when they experience the trauma, to help them understand. So if I'm working with somebody, I really have them go back and say, okay, you went through this when you were 5 years old. So how does a 5-year-old respond under stress and pressure? Scream, cry, upset, withdraw? Sometimes that's how we behave in our adult relationships. And that's what adds sometimes to the escalation of domestic violence. A way that we help somebody heal is they go back and recognize the trauma. They begin to give themselves permission to be able to look at the pain and the fear and the sense of feeling powerless when you were 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever age you were, but then to help them realize it's okay for you to allow that damaged little kid inside of you to begin to grow and to begin to catch up emotionally to where your age is. So let's go to the next slide. So I kind of want to share with you how I begin to work through this. One of the things that I realize is a lot of people who've been involved in domestic violence actually are stuck in the grief process. And it is not unusual when a person ends up being arrested, coming in for court-ordered therapy, and they begin to tell their story. They maybe have talked about loss that they've just been through. They've had horrific things happen. They've lost their job. They've had the death of a loved one. Other things have happened. Maybe they weren't using good coping skills. And so in going through some of the stages of grief, sometimes I try to help people begin to recognize their grief. And part of grief is going through shock and denial. But there's a stage of grief with anger. And some people, when they don't know how to manage the pain of their grief very well, they don't manage their anger very well. And as a result of that, you'd be surprised how many people get arrested coming out of a funeral where the family had a gathering, everybody drank, it got out of hand, whoever was upset, things get really carried to an extreme. And so helping people understand their grief and their trauma and their emotional pain that they've covered up with their anger is a lot of what we try to do in a therapeutic environment in helping people look at their own domestic violence and how they've handled their pain. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Rick. I know I'm giving you a lot of information really, really fast, but I'm going to have to tell you, one of the greatest honors in my life is to help people who've been traumatized and stuck in their pain to find a way to work through their pain and to heal and to learn to love and be loved in a healthy way. And isn't that really what most of us want? So what I've given you now is just a sample of what I call a life timeline. So each of my clients, I ask them to make major marks on a timeline identifying positive and negative major life events from birth until today. And so when they go through those major life events, they can begin to identify where they may have been traumatized, where they may be emotionally stuck. So I can take an adult person and I can say, do you understand that under stress and pressure, you respond to your partner like you're 10 or 12? And now can you see why? Let me give you a really brief example, and this is from many years ago, and I have permission to share these dynamics. So I had a gentleman who became a client, late 20s. He was married to a woman who had 2 boys. I think one was about 5, one was about 7. And each boy had a different father. And this particular man and his wife had no children together. Every Sunday night, by ritual, the 7-year-old boy, his attentive father would call him. And he'd ask about his week and encourage him. And the 5-year-old boy would get very upset because his father wasn't involved in his life. So he would begin to cry and get upset and kind of throw a tantrum. So each time when the attentive dad calls, it was a good thing, but it triggered all of this trauma in the household. Well, the stepfather couldn't handle that. And so the stepfather would begin to scream and yell at his wife to shut her kid up. And it would almost invariably create a big argument. And that was the night he got arrested for domestic violence, was one of the nights when he couldn't handle that. And he just carried on. So when we got to this exercise in therapy, and he began to identify on his own life timeline what his relationship was like with his father, he began to realize that when he was a young boy, he didn't have a good relationship with his father. And so he didn't know what that should look like. So we encouraged him that when the next time attentive dad calls and the little boy would start crying, what I said to him was, why didn't you consider asking that boy to get in the chair with you and sit with you, read a book, watch a show, do something, but be honest with him and say to that boy, hey, I don't know how to help you. I didn't have a dad. I'm not very good at this, but would you like to just hang out with me right now? Would you like to just sit with me? And I will guarantee you this is so true, and this is why it just is so vivid for me. The next week, that man came back in almost skipping and smiling. And we said, how was your week? What happened? So he went through. The phone call came on Sunday night. Attentive dad talked to the older boy. Little boy starts crying. Instead, this still makes me want to cry to tell the story. It's so beautiful. He says to the little boy, I don't know what to do to help you, but would you like to sit on my lap together? Let's just read a book and hang out. They did that, and it was quiet, and the little boy was happy. And the wife had been in the kitchen, and when she knew her older son was on the phone and there was no drama, she came out and she saw her husband and her younger son reading a book in the chair, and she sobbed from joy. We'll go to the next slide. That's, to me, some of the beauty of treatment, is to be able to help somebody unlock where they're trapped in their mind and help them be able to heal and embrace life and live life to what I would say the fullest. So the next page talks about sex offenders, and I threw this slide in here on purpose. Most of us don't have good feelings about somebody who would violate somebody sexually. I'm not certified by the state to treat sex offenders. I am certified to treat the anger management portion of a sex offense. And so sometimes I have had sex offenders as clients. But one of the things that we know with somebody who is a sex offender is that there is a need for power and control. And it is oftentimes a way of acting out their own unresolved trauma, their unresolved anger and pain. And so the problem with domestic violence is that when people are going through the cycle, they can also cycle through other kinds of traumas, including the sex offense, including other kinds of addictions, gambling addictions, other kinds of things. And so being aware that there is accountability and hope and help is something to me that's important to mention. We'll go to the next slide. So anger is a secondary emotion. And this is kind of part of what I have to teach people. And so we know that anger oftentimes is at the tip of the iceberg, but it's actually the feelings under anger that really are what's driving a person. And so one of the things that I try to help people understand is that oftentimes, because we have limited tools in our toolbox on how to handle ourselves relationally, how to love and be loved in a healthy way, that we will sometimes come in and use anger, which is kind of like our big sledgehammer or our big mallet. And if a person stays angry, people, I don't know about you, I don't like to hang out with angry people too much. I'd just as soon distance myself from an angry person. So part of what I have to do with clients is to say, how do we help you get under that anger? Because the truth is, in using your anger in that way, what you're actually demonstrating is you're not using other tools in your toolbox. And so I literally keep a toolbox in my office. And I'll sometimes pull out all kinds of tools and say, so if you're just going to go hang a tiny little picture and you need a 1-inch brad, what's going to happen if you come out with the big old sledgehammer? You know, there's a good chance you're going to leave a hole in the wall. And so trying to help people understand that our pain and managing our pain, anger is secondary. But anger is also comes when we do not know what to do with our pain. Sorry, I have a little choke. So when we think about anger management, we really want to help people get under the pain. Hurt, fear, powerless, hopeless, helpless, rejection. You get somebody who's behind bars and you hear the event that got them behind those bars, male or female, because I work with men and women. Male or female, people who are locked up. And I ask them, what happened to get you to this point? Invariably, they felt hurt, they felt rejected, they felt unloved, abandoned, humiliated, and they didn't know what to do with the pain, so they acted it out in anger. There is hope to help people in pain. Let's go to the next slide. So getting people aware of their feelings, that's pretty important. And so we actually try to help people recognize their feelings, use feeling words, express their feeling, and becoming more aware of the feeling. It's a really different thing to have a partner come home and say, I'm so angry with you, instead of having a partner come in and calmly say, it really hurt me when I felt like you didn't listen to me. Those are really different ways to say what your pain is. Next slide. And one of the things I do want to say on there, oftentimes people use substance to mask their feelings. They don't want to feel the pain. But what a lot of people don't realize, alcohol is a depressant. And so people will drink alcohol to not have to think about how they're hurting, but then it just is a short spike and then you kind of crash. So you start that cycle over and over. One of the things I really try to encourage people is be willing to face your pain. Your anger, alcohol, drugs, sex addiction, gambling, so much more. They're just a way to cover the pain. Dr. Sandra Wilson wrote a book and it says, hurting people hurt people. And oftentimes when we are doing therapeutic work with people, what I have to say is you are going to hurt worse before you feel better. So embracing your pain is really important. And anybody remember this? Well, I like peroxide. Does anybody here use peroxide? I'll even sometimes pour peroxide in my bathroom sink and plug it up. I love to watch the bubbles eat stuff up. But sometimes to help somebody deal with their emotional pain, a therapeutic process is kind of like trying to get in there and clean up the hurt and the pain that really drives that person. We'll go to the next slide. So in therapy, part of the goal of therapy is cognitive restructuring, having people rethink how they respond and rethink how they would react to something. So one of the things that we know, like I'll have a client say, can I just come to 3 groups a week and then get done quicker? But what we understand is it takes exposure over and over again, and maybe 4 to 6 months of regular exposure to different thinking can really help people begin to change. So I might have somebody after 20 or so weeks in therapy that will say, boy, I had this really frustrating situation happen and I actually stopped. I thought about it. I decided it wasn't worth me getting upset about, and I walked away. And they'll say, I don't know when I got to that point that I could make that change. But that's one of the beautiful parts of working with somebody over and over is they can make healthy, positive, more appropriate responses. Next slide. So one of the things I want to say is very few people like to call the police. People don't like to get involved. I'm a Facebook junkie. I can't say junkie. I check it a lot. And people say, I guess that's supposedly not even the social medium that everybody is using these days. I think there's a lot of others, but it's one I'm comfortable with. I've had people post on there things like, my neighbors fight a lot. I wish they'd quit. I wish they'd stop. It's very frustrating. And my response back is, if you've got people living in that house and you aren't comfortable to maybe reach out and get help for them, could you imagine what it must feel like to be trapped in an environment where you feel afraid, where you're cowering, where there's just constant arguing and bickering? That is not good for the soul, the heart, and the mind. And so one of the things that the state has said is that if domestic violence is involved with a couple, you actually cannot do couples counseling together. You have to first go work on yourselves separately. Oftentimes, that's why the courts, with an arrest and with an intervention, will mandate treatment. And somebody will say, I wish my partner had to do treatment too, but we can't do that. Even in the legislature, I tried to change some of those requirements to say, if you're going to stay with somebody, you should each learn better skills for how you're going to communicate and interact. We can't do that by state standards, but you can't do couples counseling by state standards either. Stop and think about this. And I know a lot of people, their faith is really, really valuable to them. But behavioral change does not necessarily come in and of itself with prayer and with support. It also takes action. And sometimes a crisis is actually the greatest gift that can happen to help somebody be forced to get change. Please get help. Getting help is worth it. If I could tell you how many people say, I wish I'd learned these skills in high school. I wish I learned these skills when I was younger. And so it's really important for us to consider that. We'll go to the next slide. So from the law enforcement perspective, domestic violence calls are much more life impacting to law enforcement than a bank robbery would be. It is very dangerous when the police are called for a domestic violence call. They will almost always take 2 officers minimally. And I train law enforcement officers at the Community College of Aurora on mental health first aid. And one of the officers that responded, if you remember the case in Florida, where the man was eating off the face of another person, and it was because he had taken bath salts, which is a man-made chemical that actually makes somebody almost super strong, like almost Hulk-like. And he said that that person was flinging the officers off just like they were, puppies, just flinging them. And we know that when law enforcement goes in, the risk of their safety is extremely on the line. We know that probable cause means somebody will most likely go to jail. Sometimes both parties go. Sometimes if children are present, we know that maybe one party will be left behind to care for the children when they might have both gone. So it can go in many different ways, but we very much know that sometimes the most merciful thing that happens is to try to stop somebody. We'll go to the next slide. So I just want to say that one of the most important things that we really want to think about with domestic violence is breaking the cycle. It can be broken. Sometimes it takes trauma. It takes a traumatic event to change behavior. We know that domestic violence is a community problem. We know that it is an education problem. But again, I believe most of us want to love and be loved in a healthy way. And sometimes if we allow a crisis to be intervened with before it gets out of hand, there are times when we can really help people get to a healthier place. Unfortunately, Andy, you're on this call for your daughter, Allie. That wasn't her outcome, and it isn't always the outcome. Our prayer is that we can have help sooner. And I'm going to end with this. at Allie's funeral, one of the police officers that was there, and I know, Andy, you've become friends with him. I've become closer to him as well. But as a result of Allie Raber's murder through domestic violence, the Aurora Police Department has now started a domestic violence unit, a specialty unit. And Andy, you have taken your pain, and thank you. You've just posted where the Allie Remembered Foundation is. But Andy, you've taken your pain, and you are now changing a city, and you are now beginning to change a country. And I believe you will bring change all around, trying to educate people on what it takes to recognize domestic violence and to really come together in a community, and not even to shame people, but to get them help. So I'm happy to take any questions. If anybody has any questions that are important, I respect the fact that I fly through this information pretty quickly. And
I do have some questions for you, Debbie.
Okay, good
All
enough.
right, that we're going to put into the chat. First one, is there a 24-hour domestic violence hotline to refer folks to talk to a professional when services aren't available during a work week?
A really good question. Oh, I'm sorry.
And it may not be as serious as calling the police yet and not needing to call 911.
There is a national domestic violence hotline, and we also have the Colorado Coalition for Domestic Violence. But the National Domestic Violence Hotline would have access to talk to somebody, and that's not a number. I'm sorry, I should have put it in my slides, but we could get that and send it out. And
okay.
Other can also look that up. That's an excellent question, because sometimes a person doesn't know. You don't know what to do.
All right. I will make a note of that, Debbie, and we'll be sure to get that back to the chamber as well. And then I have another question here. What are some tips you can give to get a permanent restraining order in place? Like, for instance, the victim has to show up for the court appearances.
Well, it's a good question. To get a permanent restraining order, and a temporary restraining order probably 90% of the time is issued at the time of a domestic violence arrest. It doesn't necessarily carry through to the time of the conviction. Yes, the victim needs to be involved. Well, here's one of the problems, and Andy, I sure know this from your case, but over and over again, people the protected party doesn't always respect the restraining order, and they'll still violate it. And it isn't a violation on their side, but they will still be engaged with that party. And so one of the things you want to think about is if you really believe that you don't feel safe, stand your ground. You've got to stand your ground. And a lot of times, oh, thank you. Lori Banks has just put up the National Domestic Violence Hotline number. Thank you for that. But a lot of times it's not just the victim, but it's the family members that are also put at risk. And so, yes, to get a permanent restraining order, and Andy's telling you, if you go into Allie Remembered Foundation, Andy has a ton of contacts regarding domestic violence that you can resource. But oftentimes when you go to get a restraining order, you have to let the judge know your fear and your risk factors. I've had people go in to get a permanent order, and they're the kind of people that try to act tough and like they're all together, and then the judge doesn't give it because he doesn't think they presented that they are really afraid. And so sometimes that's part of domestic violence, is minimization. And so really letting the court know how afraid you are, that is important. But also, you're right, going in for the permanent hearing, that's important.
Okay. Thank you for that, Debbie. And also, I want to give a special thank you to Andy Starrett for the information he is sharing with us via the chat, and for the ability to share his story through you. I really want to say a very special thank you to him, and we are sorry for his loss. I do have another question here for you, Debbie. What are your best recommendations for those that are not safe at home due to domestic violence, but have limited resources and options due to the rural location and current COVID-related situations with limited liability?
Wow, what a question. First of all, we do have different shelters that if somebody is really in a difficult, unsafe situation, I consider that they would look at a shelter. One of the problems with the shelter, a lot of the women's shelters don't take teenage boys. And so sometimes that becomes a problem. There are more veterinarians that would help watch out for an animal, but sometimes people are afraid to leave their pets, and especially in a rural situation. Years ago, I tried to help a woman get away from her abuser. And I will tell you that it is more risky for the people trying to help somebody get away from an offender than it actually is for those who work with offenders. But we went out to a rural setting, and I literally stayed in the car and we got a police escort while this person actually went in and she got her immediate belongings to get out, and the police escorted us just to the edge of town. And I will have to tell you, that person came after us. And I realized later that was really not a good idea for me. I should not have been the person to go in and help somebody get out. I should have let that be directly law enforcement, because we really have to be thoughtful to not put ourselves in danger. When somebody is obsessed with somebody, they're not always thinking clearly. And if you're the person trying to help somebody get away from them, then you're a barrier. And sometimes if you're a barrier, that puts you as also not being safe. And so when somebody's in a rural setting, I would really encourage you, contact one of the shelters. We have Gateway, it's Gateway Domestic Violence Shelter now, or the National Hotline. They can also offer varied resources. But I would say be thoughtful not to just go live with family. Because if you go stay with family and you've got somebody stalking you or you're not safe, it puts others at risk. So sometimes it takes a very thoughtful strategy.
Thank you for that. I have another question here. Are there different types of anger management treatment, for example, sexual offenders, bipolar, PTSD?
Well, sex offender treatment has its own whole model of treatment, and the anger management component of that would be pretty basic anger management principles. So I would say sex offenders will get specified treatment for a sex offender track, but the anger management component will be helping them to get under their, into the feelings. But for somebody who has other mental health diagnoses, such as bipolar or other things, the first thing that we would ask is that they work with their psychiatrist, their physician, they get their medications on track, and they're making sure that they're doing their own therapeutic response to be in the most stable environment possible before they could be appropriate to engage in anger management treatment. So you would kind of mainstream that individual who has other mental health diagnoses, you would mainstream them into anger management treatment. But if they aren't yet clinically appropriate, they would do individual work until they got their medications right, they demonstrated stability, and they were in a more willing and ready place to receive ongoing anger management support.
Okay. Thank you for that one. It's not really a question, it's more of a comment, and it came from Andy, and I just want to bring this out. I think this is in terms of the people that are trying to support those that are trying to escape or get away from someone. But his comment was that the last one that they had tried to help, the person who was escaping, actually committed suicide, it sounds like, to save the family that she had escaped to. So I know we've had a lot of information. Can you speak to that? That just kind of stands out in my mind. I'm glad that he made that comment. So if you could speak to that.
Unfortunately, when a person gets sort of into that victim role in a relationship, not everybody will respond this way, but some people really begin to feel pretty helpless, pretty hopeless. They begin to feel that there isn't a way out, and maybe they begin to feel like they're the problem. And if they feel like they're the problem, then maybe in their thinking, without getting added supports around them to help them find that they have possibilities, that they have a support system, that they have help, they have hope, and they have possibility, I could see that somebody would reach a point where they might think, if I'm gone, then I take the risk factors away from others. That's one of the reasons why a shelter for victims is so important, because the staff is trained and skilled to be able to put a more protective environment around that individual, to help them get to the supports, to get the mental health support they need, and to begin to recognize their value and their worth, that they are amazing, beautiful, wonderful people who can live a healthier life. That's a tragic outcome in that circumstance. Unfortunately, domestic violence can lead to a lot of hurt and pain in families if we can't get them help. And in that family situation that Andy shared, that's very tragic. I will tell you this, when I used to help in my early years of doing this, I tended to work more with victims rather than offenders. It was a very hard transition for me to move into the offender world. And back when I did that, females didn't treat offenders as much. But I've had fewer murder threats, and I'm not even saying this tongue in cheek. I used to have more murder threats when I would help a victim get away than when I worked with an offender. And I've worked with some pretty tough situations. And I still watch my back. I watch my back to this day. I've done that. I've done this work for 28 years, part-time. And it's not the work I do directly with Aurora Mental Health. I do it, I'm a contract therapist at a small agency, and I come home late at night alone, and I will guarantee you, if there are any headlights around me, even if they belong around me, I don't go home. I find a different path. So I live by watching my back. And I think you have to learn to do that in this kind of work.
Thank you. I currently don't see any more questions in the chat. I'm gonna, at this point in time, I'd like to introduce everyone to Rini Samard, if he doesn't mind, and I'm gonna unmute him for a second to see if there's any comments or questions that he has to make towards the group. At the same time, I will also post our Aurora Mental Health Center's main phone number and support line information by sharing my screen. Rini, I've unmuted you if you have any comments.
No, no questions, but I just want to thank Debbie and thank you again, Rick, for putting on a really very timely and important seminar for us. I mean, especially in the times that we're in right now. Great presentation, Debbie. Thank you. I could listen to you all day, and I also wanted to acknowledge and thank Andy for being with us today also.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. And I thank Andy as well. Andy and his wife, Tiffany, and their family are the most amazing people, and they are working hard to help other people and save lives.
Okay, I'm gonna check the chat one more time. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jamie Allister, for that wonderful comment. Says thank you to Debbie. And thank you to everyone. And again, Rini, we so appreciate our partnership with the Aurora Chamber of Commerce and Aurora Mental Health Center. And thank you for letting us participate and bring this to you and the audiences that may see this. Very, very appreciative of that. And thank you, Ms. Debbie Stafford, my colleague and friend. You were wonderful. And if there are no more comments, then we will go ahead and close out this particular webinar.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Yes, enjoy your holiday weekend. Thank you, everyone, so much. Have a wonderful weekend.